Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are joining this webinar from. I'm happy to welcome you today. My name is Chiamaka Nwachukwu, and I am the moderator for today's meeting. I'd like to welcome you, first of all, to the Youth at Work webinar series. This is a series of 6 webinars organized by the Include Knowledge platform to promote evidence-based policy making, knowledge sharing, and good practices on youth employment in Africa. At each webinar, we discuss one evidence synthesis paper commissioned by Include, as well as share discussions and thoughts from policymakers and youth representatives on different thematic areas surrounding youth employment in Africa. Last week, we had a very interesting and insightful discussion on youth employment with specific focus on the green economy. And today, we're going to be discussing youth employment with specific focus on the rural economy. I'm glad to welcome everyone today, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion, particularly because we have, yesterday, we had about 110 registered participants, and most of them are Africans, and about half of the registered participants are young people under 35, meaning that we do have the important stakeholders as part of this discussion, which I'm very happy about. So this, I believe, will create a very good dialogue, and we'll be able to make sure that we have some concrete outcomes from this meeting. So I'll start this with a few housekeeping rules just to make sure everything goes smoothly. First thing is that the webinar is being recorded, and part of the recording will be used on Include social media and websites. Now, if you would like to speak during the time for the discussions, please raise your hand and you'll be unmuted and able to speak. Finally, please leave your questions in the Q&A section and comments in the chat, and we will collate them and address them in the time allocated to clarification, questions, and discussion. However, we may not be able to take every question, so we do encourage our speakers to respond to any questions that are not able to be taken in the chat box. I hope all is clear, and I do hope that we're going to have a very exciting discussion. I'll start off first by introducing our first set of speakers who will be speaking to us on various topics on this particular conversation. And our first speaker will be Justin Flynn, who is a research officer and doctoral researcher at the Institute of Development Studies. And his research focuses mainly on understanding how young people engage with the rural economy, and particularly the role of agriculture in providing meaningful and sustainable employment to young people in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we'll also be hearing from Patience Kikoni, who is the country lead for Palladium and the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment. And then we'll also be hearing from Elisenda Puertas, who is an economist with expertise in rural employment, decent work, informal employment, migration, and social protection. She's also currently working in ILO's Sectoral Policies Department in Geneva, and she's a specialist in policy support and analytical work on promoting decent work in the rural economy and related sectors, such as construction. I hope you are as excited to hear from these speakers as I am, because I do believe that we have a lot to learn and talk about today. So I have spoken for very long, and I think I'd now like to hand over the floor to Justin, who is one of the authors of the evidence synthesis paper being presented today to make the presentation to start this webinar today. Justin, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it is great to hear so many participants signed up, and also that so many young people have signed up. That's really what this is about. It's really about trying to support young people in Africa as best I think as we can. So I'm just going to share my screen, and then we should be good to go. So. Okay, just give me a thumbs up, Maya, if you can, and Chiamaka, if you can see it. Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so Yeah, well, Chiamaka has introduced me, so I won't do it again myself, but I will introduce my colleague with whom, who is the lead author, but with whom I co-wrote the paper on rural youth employment in Africa. Basically, it was a review of the evidence. And Thomas Yeboah has a PhD from Cambridge and is a researcher in Kumasi at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. And he's trying to join us, but he's doing his best to join us, but he's having a few technical issues. Right, so today I'll especially be talking about obviously insights from our paper, which really had a focus again on the role of agriculture, which aligns as well with my PhD research. And we'll also, so the role of agriculture sort of in rural development and in employment creation. And I'll focus as well on farm job opportunities for young people in Africa. And I believe some of the other panelists might focus more on non-farm job opportunities. So without further ado, let's see if I can, there we go. So yeah, it's as you can see, it's taken from our review, which was published on the Include website, as Chiamaka said. And just very, very briefly, I know you're probably all quite aware of these, of the numbers of young people in Africa and where they reside and so on. But just for those who might not have the exact statistics in mind, just a quick refresher I think is useful. So really most of Africans are under the age of 25 years of age. So 60% of the continent's population is under 25. And it's projected that 60% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa is going to remain in rural areas until at least 2030 and potentially longer. And finally, we might have a different idea about North Africa. We might think that it's a lot more urban, and it is more urban, but maybe not as much as we thought, at least not as much as I thought. So yeah, the population that is rural in North Africa is still 43.7% as of 2019. And that obviously varies actually quite a bit from the lowest rate there, which is in Algeria at 27%, up to 57% still in a large country like Egypt, and 65% in Sudan. I think the other countries such as Tunisia and Morocco are closer to Algeria, but still, there's still a large proportion of the population living in North Africa in rural areas. So yeah, one of the major sections of our paper really focused on, again, the role of agriculture in the rural economy, and precisely, or more specifically, the role of growth in the agricultural sector and sort of its impact on the rural economy. And we were sort of arguing that agriculture is a sort of engine for economic growth in rural areas. So I'll kind of break down that case a little bit more for you. So agriculture is seen as one of the rural engines of growth in Africa. That comes from, I mean, it's been said in various studies. Here, I'm going to take the pointer out. Hopefully you can see it. There's two other, kind of commonly known engines of rural economic growth, which are tourism and mining, but those are not available everywhere in Africa, whereas agriculture is a lot more prominent. So again, that's a reason to focus on the role of agriculture and its growth. And another study on labor productivity in sub-Saharan Africa from McCullough, where stated that at the end of, in her conclusion, essentially saying that apart from agriculture, no engine for rural economic growth is apparent, again, in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, these are reasons to focus on sort of growth of the agricultural sector. And one way to grow the agricultural sector is, again, this is an argument made in the rural development and economics literature, but it's essentially to increase productivity of the agricultural sector. So the more just output you produce from the agricultural sector, basically the more wealth is going to be generated in rural areas. And the more opportunities are going to exist in the rural economy, both on farm and on farm. So in the Rural Development Report, the flagship EFAD Rural Development Report of 2016, they stated basically that the case for rural transformation and described how that happens. So again, just to quickly recap, an increase in agricultural productivity leads to marketable surpluses for farmers, which can then be sold, which then allows farmers to diversify their incomes, potentially start an off-farm business, indeed leading up to improved off-farm employment, and essentially further generating a broader base of rural economic growth. So that's how they broke it down, essentially. So if we look at ways to increase agricultural productivity or increase agricultural growth in rural areas, another paper which came out just, I believe, just at the same time as Thomas's and my paper came out, was really on the role actually of agricultural productivity increases in sort of, it's sort of made the same argument we made. It's by Thomas Jane, Louise Fox, and others. And essentially they, in that paper, they have a graph where they provide sources of agricultural growth. And just very quickly, just to give you an idea, perhaps in terms of programming or policy implications, well, how do you increase productivity? Well, you can either sort of, conduct research at a national level or at a local level and increase productivity within existing farms through sort of new technologies or new seeds, et cetera, new inputs, better technology, essentially. But another way to do that is also to provide simply more support to farmers, such as extension services, which isn't new, but there's low levels of investment at government levels in Africa, which makes the extension workers quite sparse, and it's hard for them to reach all their farmers. So one way to do that is to sort of invest more in extension services, and that may lead to, for example, input intensification, which is another way to increase productivity. Another way is to extend irrigation, of course, which it hasn't been looked at that much in terms of small-scale irrigation schemes, which just recently, I think the FAO report on global water security essentially really advocated for small-scale increases in small-scale, farmers investing in irrigation to increase productivity. And again, it's a topic that hasn't been covered as much. It's been more sort of state provided irrigation programs in the 60s and 70s that sort of dried up when funding dried up. And so that's an alternative as well to increase productivity. But I just want to say that although obviously input intensification and promoting irrigation extension and so on is, it sounds good to increase productivity. We do obviously live in an age, especially with the most recent IPCC report on climate change and global warming, that we can't just do this in any which way. And so I'd like to remember the former special reporter on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter, in his final report from 2014, really emphasized sustainable, the need for sustainable production methods. Obviously, it's also in the Sustainable Development Goals, and he really emphasized the need for example, agroecological growing or production methods, which use inputs, but they are organic or they are found locally, such as manure or food scraps. So those are just some ways of increasing productivity, but sustainably. So in terms of the effects, well, of productivity increases, in some studies, basically mainly in developing countries and also from Africa, $1, a review of literature basically found that for $1 of increased agricultural income in rural areas could lead to between 30 cents and a further $4 further in increased output in rural areas. So that means that just $1 being generated from, or $1 extra being generated from agriculture can sort of quadruple that value just by further linkages to the service industry. For example, the restaurants are able to open and service customers and so on. And retail stores can also thrive from a boost in local agricultural production. So there's quite strong data regarding that. And in Ethiopia, in fact, they intensified their agricultural sector between 2005 and 2014. Cereal yields increased by 70%, and annual GDP growth increased by 10%. And the population living under $1.90 a day went from 71% in 1995 to 31% in 2015. So that's that's less than half now who still live on $1.90, and a lot of that is attributed to agricultural intensification. So I'll try to wrap up briefly. The ILO in 2016, I believe from the World Economic and Social Outlook, wrote a chapter on basically links between decent employment and rural and agriculture and the rural sector. And you know, decent employment is kind of a tough one. I know it's not the point of this seminar, but essentially what that report says, and this relates to our findings from the paper, is that really our main goal at this point is to basically increase incomes, increase conditions generally. So incomes obviously helps, increase employment hours so that, you know, farmers are not just left idling, you know, because they don't have irrigation or something like that. So those are ways to increase employment outcomes, improve them. But, you know, links to decent employment are perhaps further down a field, and are sort of a process. But we'll just look at, just to finish, I know I'm just running out of time, but just to finish, just in terms of what types of actual improvements or outcomes can be derived from increased agricultural productivity, and what does that mean for on-farm employment and for incomes, for example, derived from that. So we reviewed some literature with examples from Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, in terms of contract farming, otherwise known as outgrower schemes. And we found, for example, that in Ghana, in rice-producing regions, including in the Volta, in northern and upper east, where rice is 80% of the rice is produced, but also regions that are you know, less wealthy than in the south, for example, yields increased by 27% and gross profit increased by 34.2%. And in fact, sort of a large review of contract farming found that that overall, essentially, by somebody at IDS, actually, one of my supervisors, found that generally contract farming can increase incomes by 38% for smallholders, but actually one caveat is that most people who derive these benefits actually have larger farms. They're typically not the ones with the smallest farms. And just to finish, in terms of agricultural waged employment, which is another way to sort of derive benefits from increased productivity. Again, from literature that we reviewed, we found that that working on plantations, for example, canola plantations in Kenya, as well as cut, you know, fresh flowers, which I think you know quite well from Ethiopia, from Kenya, working in those plantations can increase income. In Zambia, there was an example of working on sugar cane plantations, and that actually really allowed those workers to really expand their land under agriculture, because they were able to invest those incomes into their farms themselves, and it really sort of improved their productive capacity. But in Malawi as well, just this is my final point, in Malawi, it also allowed them to improve their incomes, but there is a caveat. This isn't a magic bullet. It can help. And it took, this is from a report from 2013 in sugar plantations, that those who were working as waged workers in these plantations were able to get out of extreme poverty. But in that specific circumstance, they weren't necessarily able to completely get out of poverty. So they were able to raise their incomes a little bit, but not, you know, transformatively in a way that they became, you know, well off, or at least not right away. So so there's benefits there, but, you know, these changes are probably, they come over a longer period of time. So that's what I wanted to say. I realized I went a bit over time, but essentially, yeah, that's that's our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you for that presentation. We're going to be taking clarification questions after the third speaker. So if you have questions, Justin, you can just put them in the chat box, and for some of the questions he can answer, or some of the questions we'll take later. So the next speaker I would like to have is Patience Kikoni. She'll be making a presentation from Palladium. And Patience, you have 10 minutes. I will alert you in the chat that when you have 5 minutes and 2 minutes more. I'm trying my best so I don't interrupt any speaker. So it will be great to let's keep to 10 minutes, and during the discussion, we can further expand on some points so that we have everything at once. All right, Patience, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Chiamaka, and thanks, Justin, for that overview. Can we have the slides, or should I? Thank you. So my presentation is going to zoom a little bit into the case of Uganda. Over the next couple of slides, I will talk you through the situation of statistics on youth employment in Uganda. Thereafter, I will provide a program overview on the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment. So what is it about? What does it offer? And what's the selection criteria? Then I'll provide a brief highlight on the metrics from our active portfolio. After which, I'll provide just some few emerging observations from both our on-farm projects and off-farm projects. And I'll end the presentation with some considerations and recommendations. Next slide, please. So for those not familiar with Uganda, Uganda has one of the youngest population, if not the youngest population in Africa. Over 78% of its 46 million population is under the age of 25. And it's also the country with one of the highest youth unemployment rates. Current youth unemployment rate is upward of 14%. Specifically for rural youth unemployment, we're looking at somewhere upward of 17%. For the employed youth, over 84% of the youth between the age bracket of 15 and 29 work in informal jobs. And we see this percentage is much higher for younger women. Pre-pandemic, we had a close to 1 million young people entering the job market, meaning a high migration from rural areas to urban areas in search of employment. So what is CFYE and how is it trying to address this challenge? The Challenge Fund for Youth Employment is funded by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's managed by Palladium. The goal of this program is to create 200,000 decent jobs for youth in Africa and Middle East, including Uganda. So it runs context-specific challenges that address both labor supply and labor demand constraints. And for the selected project, the fund offers anywhere between 10% and 50% of your total project budget. In addition, the fund offers technical assistance support throughout the life cycle of the project, so from selection through to implementation. Next slide, please. So how are projects selected? Projects are selected based on a number of criteria. One is we're looking at private sector driven initiatives. They should also be youth-led, meaning they should have a strong involvement or put youth center and directly involved. Youth should be directly involved in the design of the solution. Projects should usually have a high number of women beneficiaries, so somewhere towards the upward of 50 to 70% of women beneficiaries. And there should be a clear pathway to decent employment. In addition, most of the projects should integrate or demonstrate to integrate a link between not only the labor supply side, but also labor demand for decent jobs. From the fund side, we're also looking at additionality. So just demonstrate how support from this funding will accelerate the objectives of the initiative, and other additional criteria in terms of sustainability and knowledge building. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in terms of our current portfolio, and these are the number of projects that were selected from our first call for solutions that went live in January 2020. We've got 6 active projects at the moment. And from these 6 projects, we're expecting over 17,000 jobs over a period of 3 years. In terms of gender breakdown, we are looking at over 77% of these are female jobs, so jobs for women, and 23% are male jobs, so jobs for men. In terms of rural-urban breakdown, over 90% are rural jobs, and the other 9% are peri-urban jobs. So there's still very small room in the urban areas for youth employment. Then breaking down the rural jobs, we see that 78% of them are off-farm activities. And these you will demonstrate later are cut across different sectors, and 22% are on-farm activities. Next slide. Next slide, please. So in terms of, I've just selected some 2 examples of a non-farm. Previous slide, please. So I've selected 2 examples from the non-farm, or I'll start with the on-farm then. I've selected 2 examples from the on-farm portfolio, and I just want to illustrate what's coming out of this portfolio. So in terms of on-farm opportunities for youth in the rural areas, we're looking at the barrier that is commonly highlighted for rural youth employment is around ownership of land. So owning land doesn't have to be a barrier anymore. Income generating activities can be designed for youth in such a way that it doesn't require the youth to own their own land. But for our first model, the waste to value solution, we see a high number of youth jobs coming out as black soldier fly farmers. In the second model, there's also a high number of youth jobs that are created as apiculture beekeepers. And this is also through engineering farm-to-farm linkages for the rural youth with those with land. So there are ways around the barrier. The second point is around, from both of these model opportunities, we see that it does not necessarily have to require intense manual labor. I think traditionally what the case was core farming was typically an activity for men, and this was because it was labor intensive. Now, both of these illustrations illustrate that we don't have to have labor intensive on-farm opportunities for youth. Thirdly, on-farm opportunities as well are demonstrating, or we're starting to see that on-farm opportunities provide a wider or increased productivity and wider sources of income for rural youth. For the first case, we are seeing rural youth that are integrating, say, black soldier flies with poultry value chains and other value chains. And for the second as well, we are seeing integrations into coffee and moringa and other high potential and high growth value chains. Again, this builds resilience and adaptability of the youth, especially in the face of climate change and economic downturns. Lastly, on the on-farm example, we're also seeing that both models are illustrating the potential for youth to contribute even further to household income through a family and household dynamic that is coming out. So the question then is, how do we support the youth to solidify and contribute to the household income? I'll go to the previous slide just to highlight the non-farm examples. Previous slide, please. So for the case of the non-farm examples, again, I've highlighted 2 examples. And both of these are last mile delivery solutions. from these examples, what is coming out is there is a high potential for youth to earn through these business models and also create positive impact for wider communities. For the first case, it's a last mile delivery of healthcare products that is employing thousands of youth. And the second case is delivery of clean energy products that is also employing hundreds of youth. I think both models, or the first model in particular, demonstrates that the power of building on existing structures and systems. In the case of that model, they're building off local and municipal community health worker models, village health teams, in order to create income generating opportunities, especially for women. Thirdly, we are saying that in order to scale up to these rural areas requires that you have strong processes and systems in place in order to manage, of course, your growing workforce. So when we talk about systems, we're looking at new technologies and applications, and processes are more in line with HR processes and job career progression levels. I think these need to be clearly defined in order to attract youth. And lastly, on this slide, we're saying that opportunities for rural youth employment as well have to combine both the waged and the self-employment aspect. And this is to provide youth with autonomy and flexibility, but also giving them the security and stability during these very uncertain times. I'll move to the last slide, just ending with the recommendations and considerations, and I'll highlight three. The first that is basically that in all of this, you need to design systems that take into account youth aspirations and barriers. That is very key. So in our case, we conducted a youth study and youth research that highlighted three attractive sectors for youth: agribusiness, healthcare, and advocacy. Things like public sector were not attractive, were not considered as attractive sectors. In terms of top skills, it was all around ICT, leadership, and management. And also it was important for youth that the roles and employment opportunities address barriers, such as long working hours, limited growth opportunities, unfair pay, delayed wage, and specifically paying attention to gender-specific barriers like sexual harassment, cultural norms, family responsibilities, and so on. The second recommendation is around also just understanding what the market requires. So identify opportunities from the demand side. I think Justin mentioned around extension officers, and we're also seeing a very high demand for farmers for rural outgrower schemes. And this also is advantageous for youth because it combines both the informal and low-skilled youth. And it's really across all value chains and regardless of the job type. And lastly, last recommendation is around whatever you're designing has to use innovative business model. Should be tech-enabled in order to create and improve both on-farm and non-farm jobs. So if it's possible, as I mentioned previously, capitalize on the rural existing structures, increase productivity of farm, and just increase new ways and streams that youth can increase their incomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patience, and thank you for the presentation on the work that you do in CFYE. I do know that there are going to be a lot of questions on this, so please, again, if you have any questions for Patience, you can put them in the chat box, and during the time for questions and clarifications, we'll address them. So I'd like to call on the third speaker, who will be speaking from ILO. Elisenda will be making a presentation from ILO. Elisenda, you have the floor now. You have 10 minutes to speak. I'll remind you when you have 5 minutes and when it's time to round off. You have the floor now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me to share some thoughts from an ILO perspective with all of you. And I look forward also to the discussion. The more interesting insights are always there. So first, if you can, I don't know if my slides are already being featured. Yeah,
Hi, Elisenda. Is it possible to adjust your microphone a little bit? You sound a little far away. Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. So first slide, please. So I catch up on time. So I think Justin and Patience have mentioned many of the issues that we have ahead when we think of youth in agri-food systems, because we increasingly hear the word agri-food systems in rural economies and rural economies. But so this concept of systems that also includes, as Patience was mentioning, farm and so on farm, off farm, and all these activities that can occur on a rural space that are beyond the farm as well. So I think it's also this to bear in mind that we are moving and evolving from thinking exclusively from agriculture to a systems-wide approach that also recognizes that there are increasing linkages between rural and urban areas, and that it's all increasingly conceived as a continuum, because there are many rural realities that are evolving into urban areas. And even we've seen during the pandemic that people moved back to rural areas from an urban area. What I wanted to highlight is that nonetheless, and there is a lot of potential in rural economies, in agri-food systems, that they have a key role, not only, I think Justin mentioned, in terms of climate change, adaptation, and as we move ahead, looking at ways to sustainably intensify food production, because the population in the world is growing, so there will be increasing demand in the years ahead. But there is also a growing population, and that's especially the case in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's where most of the rural population is located. But there are sub-challenges ahead. I mean, most of the poverty and most is located in rural areas, especially remote rural areas. And that has been the case over the last decades. It seems to be, let's say, a trend that will go on. So unless we take action. What is also looking at poverty data is interesting is that poverty in rural areas is not only income, but also dimensions of poverty. So looking at World Bank poverty data, they made some estimations and they speak of multidimensional poverty, and they were looking also at access to services such as health, education, electricity, and so on, these kinds, and rural areas perform systematically worse off than urban areas. Looking more at what we are talking today at youth, what is worrisome is that youth are overly exposed to poverty and to informality, and that's particularly the case in sub-Saharan Africa. And despite of that, there is a youth dividend. There will be increasing young people joining the labor market, the labor force over the next. So by 2030 in Africa, there should be 144 million young people participating in activities in the economy. So we have a lot of work ahead in creating these opportunities, and the potential is there. We just need to make some steps ahead. There has been some, I think, mentioned both by Justin and Patience in terms of quality of the employment that young people have in agriculture, but rural economies, broadly speaking. And that's what we call in the ILO, these challenges, barriers. I think that's the term that was used. We call them decent work deficits, and would include informality, for example, which is something that many young people are exposed to, and I will enter into that, but discrimination at work that many young women in particular may be facing. But for example, it has been mentioned, poor job security, so let's say insecure forms of work, and limited access to social protection. So I think we need to keep thinking of those things as well. So please, next slide. I think it's important to bear in mind the context we are in now. There's been an impact of the pandemic in agriculture and food systems, in particular because it has exacerbated these challenges that we've been discussing. And it has showed and highlighted that many of these challenges are interrelated, so that probably we need to tackle them taking integrated approaches and looking at what needs to be resolved immediately because of the emergency, but also what we need to take in order to have, let's say, a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive recovery. So I will not enter into the details. You all know and you have witnesses, and unfortunately we are all still confronting many of the challenges of this pandemic. I just wanted to highlight these two things. So please, next slide. Over the long term, what we are looking at is that labor markets, at least from a labor market perspective, several dimensions are affecting, let's say, we need to resolve certain challenges, certain root causes of certain barriers that we were discussing. If we want to have, sustained results in terms of inclusion of young people in labor markets or, in the next decades. And location, so whether young people, so age is one issue in terms of inequality, gender is another one, but it intersects as well with the location. So this graph comes from the recent WISO report that has been one of the recent ones. And I wanted just to showcase it because I think there are different dimensions in terms of inequalities that this pandemic has simply highlighted and exacerbated. And in the years to come, it's something that we need to look at more systematically. Next slide, please. And something to reflect on is that young people and youth is a moment of transition. So each generation, each cohort that joins the labor market has its own characteristics, so that shapes the labor supply, and it's entering into a labor market, and that it's the labor demand that it's in that moment. And it's constantly evolving, but there are certain structural features that characterize the young people as a group that we need to take into account. Then another thing we had been reflecting at the ILO before the pandemic, but still relevant and even more if we think over the long term, it's about changes in the world of work. So some have been mentioned. So it's climate change and how the increasing role of digitalization and how, unfortunately, there might be more crises and more viruses in the near future, and how to stand ready for that and be resilient. So all that, how it relates to the youth employment challenge that was already before the crisis and now has worsened. So these are things that, and what has made us think and really make a call for action for this group is that young youth have been particularly affected. So they've lost their jobs, they lost opportunities to pursue education, especially in rural areas, because they had no connectivity to follow, educational opportunities online. Their transition for those who had completed their studies into the labor market has been completely disrupted. So these are things to bear in mind as we build a better future for the years ahead. Please, next slide. So this was just to share that in the ILO, we have a program of work on promoting more and better jobs, decent work in the rural economy. We adopt an integrated approach and we look at different aspects. So it's about creating job opportunities, both wage, but also entrepreneurial opportunities. We pay particular attention to youth. So as I was mentioning, there's a call for paying particular attention, and it comes from before the pandemic, but now with the pandemic, it's quite urgent. And we are looking at how both from the labor demand side and the labor supply side, there can be actions to go ahead. We take a sectoral look at times as well, because as has been mentioned, it's a matter of looking what needs to be done in agriculture, so productivity, working more with extension workers and how they can, promote better and safer farming practices or even more sustainable, but also safer. So there are less injuries and fatalities on farm, but also how I think the last miles examples shared by patients were quite interesting. So how there can be other opportunities in other sectors. Next slide, please. So we are working with other UN agencies and other actors. Okay, there are, in particular, in the global initiative for promoting decent works for youth, there is a thematic plan on youth in the rural economy. And we are looking how to work with other actors in the UN system, but also in the private sector and civil society. This is a platform that brings together many actors, and how to promote both by taking action at the global level, but also at regional and country levels in terms of knowledge generation, but also institutional and direct support. So that means projects and programs at the country level. Next slide, please. So we go, as I was mentioning, we go through an integrated approach. What I wanted to highlight here is the importance of policy coherence between the different sectoral actors. So that includes especially agricultural ministries and labor and youth ministries at times, or stakeholders. We work a lot, of course, with, let's say, representatives from workers and employers organizations and other kinds of rural organizations, and how there can be a collective space of dialogue and in order to promote more opportunities for youth. I think that's very important. And as we move ahead towards the future of work, investments in rural areas to make them more attractive to private sector development, but also to youth to live and work and pursue the lifestyles that they aspire to. I think aspirations is the word that has been used before. I think it's very important. I think we have to look at it, and the coordination and the voice of youth is particularly important. Next slide. So I can close here, I think, my presentation. I think there is a lot of potential. It's a matter of unlocking it. So now the crisis has been quite hard. Okay, I'm just closing, Chiamaka. So, but it gives us also an opportunity. For us, we work for and with young people, and we use the word social dialogue precisely to ensure that they have a voice and part and a real contribution to the processes ahead. And we believe also in working in partnerships with other actors, and we work with many organizations in hopefully building a better future for the rural youth. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation on the work that ILO is doing on youth employment in the rural economy. So to my very attentive audience, I know that we have been listening to a lot of information, and I would like us to now take a short 5 minutes to ask any clarifying questions that we might have. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat box, or I do have a little time. So if you would like to speak, you may put up your hand and I will unmute you and you can speak. While we synthesize our questions, I do have one question for Patience. Patient, thank you for the presentation, and I did do some research on the work that CFYE is doing, and I remember that you mentioned something about the importance of capitalizing on existing structures to be able to carry out the innovative solutions that the young people are trying to carry out. So I want to know, in your experience, how do we connect the need to be practical, to have practical solutions that build on existing structures to a need for transformation, innovation, and development? Because we know that a lot of the current practices, a lot of the current structures are faulty, and a lot of the current structures do not produce the most efficient results. So how do we, reconcile the fact that we need to be practical in the solutions and capitalize on what already exists to the need for transformative, innovative solutions that are radically different from the old way of doing things? I don't know if Patience got my question or if she can still hear me.
Yes, Chiamaka, I got your question.
Okay.
It's a good question. I think what we're saying is, yes, there's opportunity to actually build on those existing systems. It is possible, it is a practical route. So I gave an example of our first, one of our partners that we are working with, who's building on the community health worker model and the village health team. It does require, using his example, I think it does require some investment in supply chain, in your innovation around supply chain, and also it requires capital investment in terms of people and processes. So the second example I gave you was on the on-farm, was around the black soldier fly example. And these, you can see, have heavily invested in the extension worker model. I think these are two examples that illustrate that it is possible to build on existing systems, but it does require, from the private sector side, it does require some investment in terms of capital and also of innovation and new ideas.
Thank you very much, Patience. I have one question in the chat for Justin, and this is from Leonard Hoffland, and they're asking, fact is that most of the labor force is still concentrated in the agricultural sector. But on the other hand, research also indicates that young people will move out of agriculture by choice or by necessity. What are your thoughts on that? I think this question, it was to Justin or Elisenda, but I think Justin can answer that. Yeah.
Sure, and obviously, I welcome, Elisenda, if there's time, or if you want to jump in, especially as, I guess, more of an economist, obviously, please do so. But just from my side, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I in my own PhD research and in the paper, we did have sort of an agricultural as the foundation or as the basis focus, and it might come across as though it's only or all about agriculture, including in terms of employment opportunities. And that's not exactly what we would want to convey. And that's also not what I even want to focus on in my own PhD research when I go do field work. But I guess what we want to convey is that the agricultural sector, because it is an engine of rural economic growth that is found quite prominently, pervasively in Africa, there seems to be a lot of potential if we invest in that sector and it grows, just generally for rural areas. However, the actual employment that's going to come out of that, and you're absolutely right, by force or hopefully by choice, I think it's both. It's a process of both. It's going to create opportunities outside of farming, and youth, some are interested in farming, but also the aspirations literature, also says that a lot of them, look at it as, especially those who are better educated, want to sort of get out of it. Sometimes depends on the context. So, and there are opportunities in the rural areas, and I would hope that they take those up, or that people generally in rural areas take up non-farm opportunities, because they are being created, and there will be a necessity of people to take up those opportunities, and it is going to create increased wealth and improved outcomes. And I guess there's a set of policies to support that. One is, again, to invest in agriculture to create those opportunities in the off-farm sector, but also credit policies and programs, sort of much more affordable credit, can help young people, especially, start off businesses in the rural non-farm economy. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Justin. And that's important to talk about, because sometimes when discussing rural economy, it looks as if it's only agriculture that you're talking about. Meanwhile, there is so much more that can be discussed. So it was great that you pointed that out. And then I have a question for Elisenda, and this question is from Karina Franco, and they're asking, could you please talk about differences between young men and women in this issue. And this is important because, you know, Elisenda, you mentioned how gender, age, and location also intersect in the discussion surrounding youth employment in the rural economy. So if you could just shed more light on that, thank you.
Sure, very relevant question. So I think we have to think of the many, let's say, gender inequalities that are already occurring in the world of work in general. Then there are gender inequalities occurring in agri-food systems and agriculture. So for example, many female farmers are performing family work, which it's unpaid, it even comes invisible at times in the statistics. So it's unrecognized, oftentimes the effort that they make in agri-food systems, and yet they play a key role in terms of food security, if we think along the lines of food preparation and nutrition even. Then oftentimes land is not, for example, I'm just giving some examples. Land is not registered under the female. It's like a patriarchal, like a male line of recognition of land rights in many countries still. So that it prevents many young women, so many women, but even the younger generations in accessing land. And access to land has implications, oftentimes are having a collateral for accessing to credit, which could have a key role in making right investments for more productive, and we were saying even more sustainable agricultural practices, or even to establish, let's say, an activity of their own in the rural non-farm economy. But an important thing that to bear in mind for the, let's say, the younger generations is access and barriers to education. Oftentimes young women might have elementary education, but they don't pursue a secondary and more advanced education. I'm talking especially for young women in rural areas because of care responsibilities or early marriage, or they just drop out of school earlier. And it might be context specific as well. And that has key implications, especially as we were mentioning, in accessing jobs even in the rural non-farm market, so in the service sector, and for which you have to have the right skills and a certification of those skills oftentimes in order to access those opportunities and even the better opportunities. And our last thing I wanted to mention is about gender stereotypes and social norms, which in rural areas might be more prevalent and more evident and resist. And there is some, at times, more resistance, no, to change those. And those oftentimes prevent many young women and to break these generational cycles of gender inequality. So that's another area to work with. And it's not only working with women, but it's young men and women that we need to work with together to change that.
Thank you so much, Elisenda. And you raised some pretty important points, because if there are inequalities, it is going to only be just to ensure that whatever response is being put forward takes into consideration the inequalities and the structural problems that exist. So thank you for that. We're going to go to the next batch of presentations. We have two amazing speakers. The first is Esther Droppers. She's a policy officer on youth employment at the Sustainable Economic Development Department of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Amongst others, she's coordinating the Nexus Skills and Jobs program, and she's the responsible policy officer for the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment. And then we also are going to be hearing from Judith Akello. She is a programs associate at the Phoebe Education Fund, Connecting Generations, and is currently working within the YALTA project in Uganda, promoted by the Netherlands Food Partnership. So these are our next two speakers. So I'd like to hand over now to Esther Droppers. Esther, you have a maximum of 10 minutes. I'll remind you in the chat when your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'll keep it short. I was asked to reflect on the presentations, so I'm very happy to do so. I heard very interesting issues, and I would like to raise three topics. The first one is that we focus on more and better jobs. And the question that comes to mind is, what is a decent job in the context of informal economies in rural Africa, the Middle East? We have the international standards and we have the international norms, and that is certainly the ambition we should have. But to be very practical, what do we think is decent enough? Is it only an income raise? Does it have to do with safety and security? It has to do with income security, job security. And that is what we often struggle with. We have so many issues to tackle. Where do we start? And what is good enough to count this as a job created or as an income created? And I think it was also mentioned by Justin, you should approach it as a process. We cannot achieve it in one day, but still that question often comes to mind. And it has to do also with, I think it's linked to the second issue I want to raise, and that is the alignment with aspirations of young people. And that is what I like in the approach of the Challenge Fund, that young people are asked to be part of the design of the programs. And what are their dreams for the future? What is their ambition? And what aspects of this decent work agenda do they see as most important to be tackled first in a program? And I think that is one way to go about it, and to look for practical solutions in this process towards a full decent job, in the full sense of the definition. And the last issue, I think it was also mentioned by Elisenda from the ILO, is the need for sustainable and future-proof jobs. I think there is a need for jobs that also exist after 10 years, and that young people are also prepared for the job market after 15 years, and they need skills to navigate on the job market and to be flexible. So it has to do also with this education, and that's what we always aim for, an integrated approach in programs to bring the demand side and labor side together to work on education as well as on private sector. And climate neutral jobs, green jobs. So there is also a need to look at the context, identify the barriers, and then see what needs to change in the environment to enable private sector development, economic growth, and in that sense also job creation, and what systemic changes are needed. It might be a bit of a longer term goal, but I think that needs to be in mind when designing and implementing programs for job creation. It has to do with access to labor market information, access to financial services, maybe land in the long run, regulatory frameworks, social and cultural norms, social dialogue, so that parties can have a structured dialogue on the issues for the longer term agenda. There's so many limiting factors, and we need to be aware of the limiting factors and develop strategies together with the different parties and stakeholders involved to come to sustainable and structural solutions. So that was all from my side.
Thank you so much, Esther. And you used less than the amount of time you were given, which is good. I mean, you still gave us very important points to think about. So I see that Judith might be having some challenges with her connection. So I will just check if she's here. Okay, she isn't. We can wait a little bit. But before then, I would like to know if there's anyone who has any questions for Esther at this point. So I will just start with the questions while anyone who has a question can just put it in the chat box or raise their hand, and I will ask them to unmute their mic and speak. So Esther, thank you for your intervention. You did mention some important points, and I'd like you to shed a little more light on, especially with your work with the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment. And you mentioned how the process also involves the aspirations of young people. So there is a lot of discussion about youth inclusion in processes that involve youth, and different organizations have different approaches to doing things. Personally, as a young person, I have some issues with the way some organizations do carry out youth led programs and say they're including young people. So I'd like you to please share how with the Challenge Fund for Youth Employment, you have been able to actively include what young people are saying about these issues into the programmatic planning for the interventions being carried out. Thank you.
I can share some insights, but then I would like to give the floor to patients who can really talk about how they are doing it in Uganda, because there's no blueprint for youth participation. I think there are different ways of doing it. You should be careful that it doesn't become tokenism. You want to be inclusive, but you cannot ask all the young people to get involved. So it is a struggle, and I think the Challenge Fund has gone in a direction that that works well. And maybe patients, you can share on how you've been involving youth in the design and the implementation of the programs in Uganda. I think that's a very nice example of one way of doing it.
Yeah, thanks, Esther, and thanks, Chiamaka, for the question. As I highlighted earlier, I think our first step was basically to understand what these aspirations and barriers are. Having a youth-focused research and also having youth involved in the conducting of this research, integrating the youth in the team was also built on in just coming up with these findings. So just to reiterate on the findings, yeah, the most attractive sectors being agribusiness, healthcare, and advocacy, and the top skills being ICT, leadership, and management. And then in terms of barriers, we're looking at limiting growth opportunities, long working hours, and very gender-specific barriers like sexual harassment and cultural norms. So yeah, with the Challenge Fund, or through the Challenge Fund, we really have integrated youth at the center of the program, not only in research, but also when I look at the current portfolio that we have, I think more than half of our partnerships are youth-led, youth-driven, and yes, you have a very strong youth focus.
Okay, thank you very much, Patience, for throwing light on that. And you know, it's something that I hope that is brought out in every conversation on challenges that have to do with young people, because I think that it has been researched very properly that it's important to include young people from the very inception phase of whatever solutions are being put forward in order to ensure that you're getting the most beneficial results at the end of the day. So I have a question for Elisenda, and this question is in line with something Esther mentioned. And there's a lot of talk about increasing youth employment and decent employment, but I'll just this may seem like a very simplistic question, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'd like to know, how can we define or how can we recognize decent employment? What are the parameters that we can start to look at to say that this is the decent employment, bearing in mind the fact that this definition might be changing and might be dynamic as time goes on, but what are the things that the ILO has, some of the parameters the ILO has put in place to define or to describe what decent employment, especially for young people and young women, would look like?
It could take us a whole lecture to go through the concept of decent work, but in a nutshell, there are 4 pillars that confirm this very concept. One is employment. So if you have an employment, the second one is more related to international labor standards and working conditions. So there is many of the issues that have been captured in terms of like insecure forms of work, long hours, having, you know, some rights in terms of being able to also, I mean, defend your, you know, your labor rights, no? So more these type of things. I'm oversimplifying here. And there are certain forms of work that are unacceptable, and there's child labor. So I posted some recent figures on child labor, for example, but also forced labor. So some now call it modern forms of slavery, but basically is people being forced to work and having no choice to say no. So avoiding that is part of, you know, having a decent work as well in certain contexts. And importantly, and the pandemic, so a third pillar is, you know, access to social protection or forms of, you know, safety in the workplace. And I think this is very important for what we are discussing today, because many young people are working in the informal sector. And oftentimes this means no access to social protection. So when a crisis comes and there is no, you know, they lose their job, that means that they have no access to any, you know, safety net until they find the next job. And that's particularly true in rural areas, because extension of social protection is still a gap in many rural areas. And I think in Africa, that's particularly the case. And another thing to bear in mind that the pandemic has also, you know, put light, no, highlighted, underscored, is the access to safety. So now we are all getting used to Maxon, but there is more to that. Is knowing and having access to safety equipment. So at times is, you know, a mask, at times is a helmet, depending. I mean, and in agriculture in particular is, so oftentimes is knowledge about using chemicals. And with the exposure to climate changes, working under higher temperatures, and that has implications for people, for farmers, for workers, for anybody engaged in agriculture, and that affects the productivity. So that affects labor productivity directly and indirectly as well, because I mean, if people have accidents, they cannot work. So, and the last but not least pillar of this work is what we've been talking about, this social dialogue. So having the possibility, and I think for youth, we have mentioned many of us, so having the possibility to participate, so our processes in which the policies, collective agreements, if we are thinking of wage employment. But if you think of youth, it's youth policy, a youth program, having a voice and, you know, a participation in an investment that is being done in their area. Maybe they have opinions about what would be the priorities for their own economic activities. And do they have a place in those processes? Do they have, you know, are there aspirations and, you know, and needs listened to? So in a nutshell, that would be.
Thank you so much, Elisenda, for that important intervention. I see now that Judith is back. I'd like to know if she's ready, but we won't have time for the full presentation. So if you can just give a short talk for 5 minutes, we'll be happy to have that. Judith, if you can hear me, please unmute your mic and say hello.
Hello.
Okay. Are you ready to go now?
Yeah. I got some challenges with my internet, so I went off and I had to look for another computer. But I'm now fine. I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. But we're out of time, so we can't take the full presentation. So if you can just share your interventions in just 5 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
So you won't be able to project my presentation, is that it?
Yes, because we're out of time. Yes.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay, so sorry about the interruption. But I wanted to share something. Mainly, when you look at most of the people that spoke before I went off, I realized that they really appreciate the fact that youth employment in the rural economy, like youth are really, really engaged and can do something better in the rural economy. But what I want to emphasize is especially the policy, the people that are involved in the policy formulation. Someone talked about COVID and realized that right now, most youth have been actually affected by COVID. But unfortunately, agriculture is there as an opportunity, but you find that most youth are actually not involved in agriculture. And this is mainly because some of them don't have the skills to get involved in agriculture, as well as the finances to get engaged in the agriculture. So what would I like to emphasize? I'd like to emphasize the bottom-up approach, whereby the policy makers, the people that are involved in the policy formulation, that are involved in policy formulation, government. Are you able to hear me?
Sorry, Judith, we can't hear you properly.
You can't hear me?
Now we can, but earlier we couldn't hear you properly. Now we can.
Okay. So I was saying that I would like to emphasize the people that are involved in policy formulation to really encourage bottom-up approaches whereby they involve the youth in whatever they do, consulting with them instead of thinking for them, like kind of having a dialogue to understand the challenges that youth are facing, other than like you find that most policy people, when they come up with policies, they want to think for youth. But youth have the zeal and the potential to think for themselves and also get engaged in things that concern their lives. I would also like to share the importance of exposure, having hands-on. If we have youth that, if we have youth exposed to various places, for example, the YALTA organization does what we call the caravan. Exposure to visit farms, to visit youth that are really doing good. They can be inspired to also learn from them other than just sitting down on their skills, because some of us, the youth, we have the potential to do better, but we don't know how to do it. So if we are given opportunity for exposure to learn from other people, to learn from the youth that are doing better, we can be encouraged to do more other than just sitting. Personally, my inspiration to get involved in agriculture, I was inspired by other youth. Had I not met many youth of YALTA, I would never have even gotten involved in agriculture. The other thing I would like to really share is the having the first people, like people first approach. You know, our government has kind of a tendency to sit down and then think and also share ideas amongst themselves, but they never really get down to the rural areas in Uganda. So thinking from up, let's say in parliament and discussing things for youth in parliament may not really help, like coming down on ground and understanding what the youth really go through. Because majority of them are maybe in gambling. How about if we brought them together and discuss the issues that affect them on ground? Yeah, so I had really so much to share, but because of the interaction with my internet, my computer, I'm really sorry. But maybe for the people that are on the platform, maybe Maya will share my presentation with each one of you.
Thank you so much, Judith, and thank you for your presentation. I would have looked forward to hearing your full presentation. We're out of time, but I do want to ask a specific question. If you could just share a question I shared with the audience, but I'd like to ask, since you work directly you are a young person and you work directly with young people working in the rural economy and agribusiness. So I want you to share maybe one example that you have of employment creation, both on and off farm in the rural economy based on the young people that you work with.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, so I'm asking that can you share one example of employment creation, both on or off farm, that it's, you know, with the young people that you work with or that you have been involved with in your work with YALTA?
Okay, I'll share an example. One of our YALTA members, she's called Chiamaka. She's processing coffee. She has her coffee, she processes it, but she also has a farm that she's using to teach other young people how to do actually agribusiness. So besides the coffee, she's involved in vegetable selling. She does vegetables, but organically. One of our presenters said that we must encourage farming that is more sustainable using organic means. And as YALTA, YALTA is really emphasizing this, going farming simply, animal, but use a lot of, use less energy. And that is using the organic methods. That's just one example of one of our YALTA members.
Thank you so much. And you made a very important point, Judith, that it's important to encourage farming or agricultural businesses that are more sustainable using less energy, because last week we talked about the green economy, and that's an important way in which both of them intersect, that as we create more jobs, that we're also looking at jobs that are also more sustainable. So we are coming to a close of this meeting. We had so many questions, but unfortunately we cannot take all of them. I will just now do a wrap up of all the important points that, well, I mean, it's not all the important points because we have talked about a lot, but some of the important points that I was able to write down. So the first is that, which is the most important to me, youth inclusion in programmatic planning and development. And this needs to be from inception. As Patience puts it, you have to take into consideration the aspirations and desires of young people from the very beginning. And then as Justin and Thomas wrote in the synthesis paper, you cannot assume for young people what they will do in certain situations. You cannot decide the aspirations for them. You do have to ask, research, and include it into planning. So that's the first thing. The second thing, that it is important not just to create more jobs, but also to create more jobs which are decent, meet up to international labor standards, as Elisenda mentioned, and jobs that are sustainable. In addition, we also mentioned that youth employment in the rural economy involves development both on and off farm, which is an entire value chain that can be explored for decent employment, especially for young people. Another important point is that it is important to be practical in solutions, to build on existing structures. So innovation doesn't always have to be stuff that are off the charts, completely new. It's important to also say what already exists and how can we make it better, more sustainable, and more suited to that particular environment. And then finally, I'd like to mention that it is important to remember that decent employment, especially for young people in the rural economy, is a term that is dynamic, changing, and it's something that we are going to keep learning more and more about every day. There is no set end goal or end point, but as with each time we learn, we go back, we strategize, and make sure that we are able to get new ways and ideas to make development even better and faster. So thank you everyone once again for coming to today's meeting. We kept the time today. We're 2 minutes ahead of time. Next week, we're going to be having another discussion on conflicts and crisis, if I'm correct. Yes, conflicts and crisis next week. And it is same time next week, Tuesday. And I will also be moderating that session. So I do hope to see every one of you there next week. If you would like a presentation, Maya has requested that you please put your email in the chat box so that she can send the presentations to you. Finally, thank you to all our wonderful speakers for keeping the time and for sharing all your knowledge with us. It was very wonderful hearing you speak and share all the experience that you have gathered this year. Thank you once again and have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.